Hey, all right, okay, we're good. Okay. Okay, well, thank you so much for sticking around. I know this has been a long period, but I really appreciate you all listening. And I hope that you take something from this that is worthwhile. So this last semester, or actually in the past, I was reading The Myth of Sisyphus by Albert Camus. And in the beginning, the very first sentence of that book, he says, there's but one philosophical problem, and that is suicide. And he goes on to say that the other philosophical problems, those are secondary. The question of whether or not life is living amounts to the most fundamental question we can ask for ourselves. And this was around the same time that I was reading Heidegger's work, which what he was saying was that the most fundamental question is being, and questioning our being, and understanding like who we are and what we stand for and how we're standing for it. And I began to see a parallel between these two. And so I decided that I should investigate the connection between our concept of suicide and our concept of being, and questioning not only being as a whole, but questioning our own being. And so one thing that when we think about suicide right off the bat, we tend to think of the act itself. And so we have, there's just that one moment, whatever the person ends up doing to end their own life. That's what we tend to think of suicide, and that's where all the statistics are taken from. Now, what I want to consider is the development that leads up to this act, how somebody arrives to it. And I find this to be more significant because where we could focus our attention to the act is only the last moment of this long development, this period that came up to it. And if we can understand the intricacies of that development, which is how our being evolves up until the act, then then the act itself, why somebody ends up killing themselves at the end, can make much more sense. Now, in order to do this, I'm going to begin by trying to show why our current concept of suicide, which is very much based on the act itself and condemning the act itself, condemning those who are outside of ourselves as morally insufficient because they have chosen to kill themselves, as an insufficient concept of suicide. It does not take into account the more developmental aspects of it. Then we're going to look at what that development actually looks like, how somebody's being does evolve as it's going along this development. And then finally, how reposing the question of suicide in an ontological framework, which relates to how we're examining our being, is much more beneficial to us in understanding why people commit suicide and how we can end up eliminating that from our society. So to begin, we're going to begin with the insufficient concept of suicide. The vast majority of Americans, and this has obviously changed over time, but the vast majority of Americans believe that suicide is morally wrong. It is something that other people do that is evil and is not and it is kind of distinctive from people who are morally good and do not have anything to do with suicide and are not indulging in that. It's seen as an egotistical act. It's seen as something that is not taking into account the greater good. And we're very much ostracizing those who deal with suicide in doing so. However, it's interesting that over time there's this growing minority of people who do not think it is morally wrong, that it's a morally acceptable thing. And it's not that it's to say that it's good, it's to say that we shouldn't be condemning those who deal with suicide. Because again, it's not the act itself, it's the development that leads up to the act. And not only does the focusing on the development help our ways of not condemning. Not only does the focusing on the development make us understand why somebody ends up killing themselves in the end, but it also suggests the possibility that everyone, in a certain way, is along this development in some degree, and that in order to understand how it could possibly be manifest in ourselves, even though we might not be the ones to commit suicide, it can be further understood in the way in which we question our being, even though we may not end up killing ourselves in actuality. Now, this argument against suicide as a moral atrocity can be rooted back in Kant, where he says that essentially when we kill ourselves, we are and we're kind of desiring death in a way. We're actually ripping a part of morality out of the world. That we have these obligations. We have these obligations to be moral people and whatnot. And as moral agents, we have a duty to continue to exist in order to further morality. And if we were to kill ourselves, then that would be essentially to try to eliminate morality itself, which in a way is the ultimate sin, to be the antithesis of morality. And based off of this argument, we can kind of conclude that the goal is to continue existing no matter what in order to further our moral agency. Now this is possibly what is in play when we consider the story Brave New World, which is a story about how a society has completely integrated each and every one of its members in such a way that nobody is actually in risk of suicide. Everybody has completely lost anxiety. There's all these measures so that nobody will kind of go over the edge, and everybody feels good about it. Everybody is self-righteous about it, and they feel as though they're playing a good role in society, and that we have made progress because of this. Now the problem with this is that in so doing, in trying to eliminate all anxiety from our world, we have essentially, the people in Brave New World have eliminated part of their essential being. They have completely destroyed their concept of relationships. They completely destroyed their concept of love of the other, and they take and they have followed. They've seen the use of soma to be the most natural way in order to keep existing. And there's a character who, midway through the book, as you can see here, he says, "Do you feel as though you've ever had something inside you only waiting for you to give it a chance to come out?" So it seems as though, even though we continue it to exist, being in a society that does not permit suicide, we have, in a sense, made it so that there may be parts of us that are completely disjoint with how we're actually playing a role in society, and that over time, this disjunction between who we are and how we're actually living in the world becomes an insufficient way to live our lives. And so, to see that as that's insufficient, as seeing just elimination of suicide, as seeing the other as who commits suicide as morally wrong, we are not making progress in confronting the problem of suicide in its very essence. So now we're going to talk about the development of suicide, how somebody actually experiences their life coming up until the act, and how they are confronting the issues that come their way. It all starts with the question of why. And when somebody reaches an impasse, there often comes this earth-shattering event where we begin to question our own principles, question our own ethics, and this sort of world-altering event makes us not really know how to continue on, how to move forward in confronting this question. An example is that oftentimes people who lose a large sum of money end up committing suicide, but also those who gain a large amount of money also commit suicide because they're being confronted with a world-shattering event that does not that confuses them to the point that they don't really know how to answer that why. The why being, what does money mean for me? How am I as a being in relation to money, and how I'm working with that? And so, in asking this why, we can't answer it. There is a middle term. There is a way in which we can kind of eliminate this, go out of the suicidal dynamic if we take this why seriously. And this is what I'll call the middle term, which I'll discuss later. However, If we don't, we oftentimes become ostracized by our inability to answer the why. If we don't know what money ever meant to us, we end up becoming disillusioned with our role in relation to how we're using the money and whatnot, and we become alienated. We're still in society, but we're not actually able to be in society. We're not ontologically part of society. And what this leads to is this sort of back and forth between what I call self-oblivion and self-destruction. And an example here, well, I suppose I should define these two. Self-oblivion is where one completely forgets kind of what is at the ground of their being and sees themselves as kind of in the bad faith. They kind of see themselves as a certain thing which they're actually not. And so it's self-forgetfulness. And then self-destruction is doing things that we know are bad for us consciously, and yet doing them anyway. An example I had here was in the collection of suicide notes I read. There was an example where a son felt as though he couldn't live up to his father and committed suicide because he didn't think that he could really live up to how great his father was. And in so doing, he has kind of forgotten who he is himself and has seen himself as someone who must live up to his father. And in so doing, leads into self-destruction. However, if he recognizes that he's falling into self-destruction and he finds that he doesn't want to do that, he may bounce back into some other form of self-oblivion, into some other pocket of society that is also at odds with his being. And then that may lead to another form of self-destruction because there's always this insufficient, narrow concept of being that is being bouncing back before. However, we are not doomed to oscillate back between these two states. There is the middle term, but it requires asking that middle term, why? How am I going to answer that question? When, for example, this person who loses a large sum of money, I'll put these up first. When they're considering their future choices with the fact that they have to deal with this large sum of money being lost, they're examining the possible futures that they might kind of move into. And that's the subject, that's the person who has lost much money. Here they are trying to examine the certain ways in which they can move forward into certain possible events. And what Heidegger says is that our state of being is always kind of an unfinished state of ourselves because we're always choosing between these future events that we could possibly move into. And that unfinishedness always is at the very core of who we really are. And he continues to say that eliminating what is outstanding, what are these outcomes, what these future things to be fulfilled are, is equivalent to annihilating its very being. And so, in choosing suicide, we have essentially cut ourselves off from all of these events, and it's an attempt to kind of section ourselves off from possible futures. However, it's not the desire for death itself, even though it's the desire for being sectioned off from futures. It does not mean that it is trying to, as Kant would say, eliminating a portion of morality itself. And so I've had a schema here where we have S who is confronted by some impasse X, and in wanting to escape X, he or she chooses kind of the negation of X, or just not trying to escape, to see this X and choose anything but that is not X. However, because X, and so not X itself is indeterminate, is not a determinate way, like decision I can make. However, there may be possible events that could lead me into not X, say some reasonable alternative A that is not X. However, because of this obfuscation that we can't really perceive the possible futures ahead of us, there seems to be a barrier between S and A, where S just cannot see any other option besides not X. And because not X is indeterminate and X wants to escape X entirely, not X implicitly is a desire for death. But S does not desire death directly. S desires death indirectly. And so it is not that S desires to eliminate morality from the world. It is that S just wants to escape some future possibility X. And then death obviously reaches back onto S in the act of suicide. But this is not a direct desire for relinquishing our moral duties. It is just an indirect desire to do so based off of moral or kind of confrontations that are impasses. And so this is sort of this enigmatic state of where how is it that we can eliminate, kind of like escape from this oscillation between self-destruction and self-oblivion. And that's what I want to talk about in how we're going to repose the question of suicide in an ontological way. Now the word ontological or an ontology tends to scare some people, and when I brought this paper up to people asking them to come, they were like, oh, what is ontology? So we should just talk about what exactly that is first before we ask the question of suicide in an ontological way. When we say ontology, we mean that when we're talking about ontology, we're saying that ontology is the study of the ground of being. And so if we have some being, there's several different aspects of the way in which we can talk about that certain being. There might be a biological way we can talk about it. We could possibly talk about it sociologically, or in any number of other things. However, we cannot actually speak about the being of this very being reducible to any of these qualities, because if I were just to talk about something biologically, I would be obviating the other aspects of it. And when we're thinking about a subject who's thinking about him or herself, if he or she thinks of him or herself as one of these aspects, they have essentially obviated or have fallen into the state of self-oblivion by forgetting these other aspects. And so when we're speaking about ontology, we're thinking about what kind of precludes the entirety of all these aspects and kind of grounds them in one concept of ontology. So why would this question, which seems terribly trite, why would this question of ontology, which seems as though it's this sort of armchair philosophy kind of question to ask, be anything relevant to suicide? And now, so when we're thinking about suicide, we're really questioning our relationship with death. When we're thinking about what it means to live and what it means to die. And now, if we, the way in which Heidegger talks about death is that he describes it as something that is absolutely our own event to fall into, and is not something that can be taken by anybody else. Nobody can take the event of death away from us. It is our thing to deal with and experience. And he says later that it's the imminent possibility of our own impossibility. It is not something that somebody else can experience for us, nor that we can somehow we can choose a possible future that is elsewise from it. And so the way he puts that is that it is our own most non-relational sense, that it's not something that I have a relationship with anybody else, an insuperable possibility. Now, what Heidegger comes to find with this is not to kind of mope about our own demise, but to realize that in death being our own most possibility of impossibility, it kind of contextualizes our own life as a totality. In pondering the fact that we will die and that possibility is our own most, it also means that the development up until death is also our own most. In finding that death is our own most possibility, we also realize that our life is our own most possibility as well, and that all the possible situations that we could possibly make in the future are our decisions. It adds an ownership of our own life. Now, suicide adds to this complexion, because even though death is an insuperable possibility, suicide is a superable possibility in the sense that I can choose whether or not it happens. And so taking this understanding of our life and finding that it's our own most, but then also adding to it the fact that we have the ability to bring that death about or not, also adds to our concept of how much we value our lives, because we are saying that the totality, not only are we owning it, but it is also within our means to control whether or not how quickly that our almost possibility comes about or not. And in that sense, when we're questioning suicide, when we're questioning the fact that we have this totality of our own most life and being, that it is our way of answering the question why, of not just answering it in some small framework, but answering it ontologically. Now, the difficulty with this is that it's not just philosophy. It's not just our ability to rise above ourselves and not really and call it that. It really just takes telling somebody to just shape up and get a handle of your own life. It does in talking about the question of suicide as something that is ontological and not just as reducible down to one study or one aspect of our being. We have to accept that it also has as much to do with our physical health as it does our mental health. And it is something that may be analogous to brushing our teeth or getting exercise every day. It is something that is absolutely essential, and that in that way we can learn from mental health, which treats these problems of depression and suicide as physical problems or psychological problems or whatnot, and we can learn something from that study. Now, what I'm also saying is that mental health can also learn tremendously from our concept of philosophy and ontology. So from philosophy, philosophy offers to mental health a concept of ontology that isn't just reducible down to one medical aspect of ourselves. But at the same time, mental health can offer philosophy what it is lacked, which is kind of a psychological concept of ourselves, to see ourselves as not these floating minds above our bodies, but to recognize that our being is here and that we must confront it as such and as present and as our own most. Now, this being said, this question of why is not just asked in the abstract. It's not just asked without an expectation of without an expectation of anything else. And I have a quote here of Viktor Frankl, who himself he went through a concentration camp where he was kind of examining what was the different things and factors that made somebody successful in either surviving that experience or not. And he found that the people who were able to keep that high standard and always asking the why of their own meaning and not being kind of bogged down by their own situation, those were the people who ended up going on and were able to help their fellow man and coming out of that situation alive. Whereas the people who gave up, who decided that the question why and the question of their own being was worthless and it was not really anything to continue questioning, those were the people who were not able to survive that experience. And so I just love this quote from him that he talks about how even the helpless victim of a hopeless situation, facing a fate that he cannot change, may rise above himself, may grow beyond himself, and by do so changing himself. And in a way, back to that example of how there's this impasse and we can't perceive the alternative, the question of ontology is in a sense trying to break down that barrier that was not allowing us to see the alternative. And not only to do that in one case, but in all cases, to have this doctrine being that we're able to not reduce ourselves down to one little aspect that puts blinders on ourselves, but is able to confront every single situation that can possibly come about. So that's kind of the framework that I'm suggesting, but it really does require us taking responsibility for the question. It is not something that is just contained in a little paper that I write, but is a question that is really put on every person to answer in their own way. But I do think that posing the question this way is a useful and expanded way of dealing with the problem that really needs to be confronted, and to not see suicide as just a thing that is immoral of other people doing, but is something that we must answer in our own way, in our questioning our own being. So, yes, thank you. Any questions?
Yes. I'm curious how, from this framework, how would you classify suicides that are rooted in sort of mental disability, where people who actually don't really possess the ability to move beyond the why? Is that like that ontological failing feels a little more permanent? Is there a way out of that? Do you have? Is there a societal solution to that?
Well, and that is why I was adamant about including the consideration that it's not just a philosophical problem, but it is very much to do with kind of the overall health of a person. And when we think about people who are have those mental disabilities in that way, we're admitting that the problem of suicide has as much to do with their mental well-being as it is in physical being, as it does with the way in which we think about possible life. But it also is a way of, in caring for them in their mental disability, we have discounted them as beings, and we're not saying that they're flawed or immoral or whatnot, but that we're actually adding legitimacy to the other and caring for them in the way in which we're not thinking of them as like flawed or whatnot, but to recognize that we have a duty towards others as they are as whole beings and not just as like flawed individuals. Yeah.
In your research, did you come across what some of the ancient Greek philosophers felt about suicide?
Yeah, so, well, it's funny because one example that's oftentimes cited is Plato, who, well, not Plato, Socrates. There's the classic tale of how he was forced to commit suicide at the end of his life for corrupting the youth of Athens. And he actually had the opportunity to escape prison and avoid the situation altogether, but he chose to die anyway, out of the sense of, for one, he didn't want to break the laws of the Athenian government by escaping jail because he had respect for their laws. But then he also saw death as this sort of possibility of moving beyond the material existence. And so he almost welcomed death because it was a way of moving on to the next stage in life. But elsewhere in my paper, I really tried to argue against that attitude of thinking seeing death as the next thing in life, because it kind of obviates our responsibility to put value in the timeline that we have. But then there's also, as Sean talked about, there's also the Stoics who I think did argue against suicide because they said that even though you are in like a terrible situation, there's always a responsibility to like accept your situation and whatnot. But yeah, there are some interesting voices in the ancient literature of how people saw it not only as like a psychological condition, but of just like a way of dealing with hardships that come around that. But I did not do as much research in the ancient philosophy as I did in the other literature. Yeah.
How would you relate this question to medically assisted suicides? That's kind of becoming...
Yeah. So that was a really interesting. That was something that was talked about in the collection, the suicide note collection, and I'm kind of, in a way, this can be. I would take this as perhaps an argument for medically assisted suicides, because in our when we're considering our ability of valuing our own most life, not only seeing death as giving life to ourselves, but the possibility of suicide is making that our own most like a question that we can answer or not. I'm arguing that that ability is actually a good thing. That when we're thinking about our own most being, if we add that ability to somebody, then they can feel so much more in charge of their own lives. And that was something that was one of the quotes in the Suicide Collection Notes is that somebody who said, he said something along the lines of that I'm not going to do it ever, but I feel so much better than I know I could. And so I think I would argue for doctor-assisted suicides. Yeah.
Well, I guess this is nothing very related to that last question. So you talked about how starting with like having a very sense of death as our almost possibility, and then we can transfer that onto life by knowing what we bring about. So what do you think about cases where like institutions or society prevents people from ever, so like prisoners aren't obviously people that kill themselves if they want to prevent it, or like we institutionalize somebody who's suicidal. Do you think that we're somehow wrong them by preventing them from having a sense of ownership over their own life, or like it's just a necessary, like is there some sort of contradiction in the fact that we're ruling out a society to physically prevent people from it, but then also saying like this is how we gain some sort of ownership over our own life?
Are you saying like the people who are sorry, can you just repeat?
Yeah.
So, what are the case studies you're talking about? Just like when somebody's put in an asylum and they're...
Yeah. So you're saying, okay, so death is our own most because nobody else can face it for us.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's something is completely ours and ours alone. And then you were transferring that ownership back onto our attitude towards our own life through our choosing not to actualize that possibility or whatever. Which for most people we could see as the case, but not everybody is in a, like prisoners in a jail system don't have an opportunity to commit suicide. That's like taken away from them.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
So does that also like lead to some sort of their own ownership over their life is taken away, not just in the
I see. Yeah.
in the like physical demands of the outside or inside staying yourself, but in like a much deeper sense? And would that be a problem?
That's interesting. I mean, like, yeah, when you think of situations in prisons where people are guarded against that, I think that I would say that is something where somebody is being deprived of where you're. I mean, prison, like being in a prison. The whole point of that is stripping away somebody's possibilities of who they are, and in many ways, prison is an attempt to kind of take away somebody's ownership of their own life and to kind of put them in some other framework. And so I do think that like putting somebody in a prison is actually an act of taking away their ability to have their own their own ownership of being. But it's not to say that like they should or whatnot, but just like that act of taking away that opportunity and condemning it as something completely immoral is something that takes away somebody's ability to have their own being, have their own ownership of. Yeah.
How do you think a sense of community and other people is important to somebody's sense of self? I'm just thinking like in some of the areas that have the highest rates of suicide, there's also the highest rates of loneliness. And so how do you think that interacts with your kind of ontological reason for suicide, or is that like strictly based in the mental health side of it?
Yeah, if I were to do another paper, I would write all about that. And I didn't really talk about how this problem of suicide has to do with the other, of how we're forming a relationship with the other. I think one thing I am pointing to is that we have to be careful with community, because if we just have a community just for the sake of keeping people alive, then that harkens back to the insufficient concept of suicide. But if we're able to have a community in which people are able to bring out kind of like the ground of other people's being, then I think that's something that's absolutely essential. And actually, the dialogue that that people have with one another is actually kind of the means by which that comes out from one another. Like being in and of ourselves is kind of an insufficient way of living, and that's why loneliness it causes suicide so often. But yes, I certainly think that though we need to be careful about it, that's certainly an essential aspect of being able to ground our.
So would you agree that to be is to be perceived, and so we need somebody else to perceive us?
Maybe, yes. Yeah.
I kind of want to return to Joseph's line of questioning a little bit. Just on a really basic level, do you see a contradiction between asserting that death is to be confronted by someone on their own terms in their own way, and then attempting to build societal practices that not like makes suicide wrong, but like try to make it less possible and try to steer people away from it in a more productive way?
Oh, you think that there's a contradiction between those two?
I'm asking if you think that a contradiction exists between saying, okay, a person is free to choose their death and meet it in the way that they feel is appropriate, but building a society that is attempting to avert as many people from suicide as possible. Do you see a contradiction there, or does the societal thing, does that fit in with
what? Sorry.
Yeah. Let me think about how to rephrase this. Okay. Does the societal desire to reduce the number of suicides, basically, because that's at the heart of no matter what.
Yeah.
Does that desire impinge on the freedom to choose death in no matter what form it takes, whether it's effective or ineffective? Or by building this more effective ontological premise, do we take care of that issue?
Yeah, so I think I understand your question. It's, oh gosh.
I can try to rephrase it again.
Let's talk after. Because
I
I think there's a grain of something that would be.
I think there is too, but I know that.
Yeah. Well, I know we're kind of cutting up on time, but if we'll ask any four of the presenters, because these conversations keep on going afterward, and they don't end here. This is something that we're all going to continue reasoning about for the rest of our lives. So please ask any one of us, and thank you so much for coming.